welcome to Stillspeakpod. We have a few updates on the unraveling of the Murdaugh family. So Jim Griffin, that is one of Alex Murdaugh's lawyers, seemed to be rather chatty this week. And he started off by confirming that SLED, South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, just as a reminder, has been investigating Alex, quote, from the get-go, unquote, for the June 7th murders of his wife, Maggie, and son Paul. And Mr. Griffin insisted that his client, Alex, visited with his mother, who has dementia at the time of the murders, and he had no motive to kill them. I beg to differ, Mr. Griffin, greatly. I think most people would beg to differ with you that there was no motive at all. Quote, you would think that if Alex was the one who did it, that SLED would have been able to establish that pretty easily that night. You would think they would have searched his house and they would have found blood somewhere. You would think they would have found the murder weapons on the property. You would think they would come up with something to link Alex to the murders, forensically or independent evidence. To my knowledge, they have not done that, unquote. And I know originally it was circulating that there was 2 different guns used. It was a rumor. I have not seen it confirmed anywhere by law enforcement that was true. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. But I looked it up and I couldn't find anything that confirmed it other than the rumor itself. Or the source information, I should say. So it's rather interesting that he said murder weapons. And I mean, of course, Alex is being looked at or considered during this investigation, since he was one of the closest people to Paul and Maggie. And he was also the one to find the bodies. I think it's rather common sense that Alex was at minimum a person of interest. What I'm not hearing in this statement, which is always key, what are you not hearing? And what we don't hear in this statement is that Alex has been ruled out. That's key. Then Mr. Griffin admitted that authorities are not sharing information. Of course not. They never do, really. But then he added, I believe if they had that information, they would have charged Alex. And they have not charged him. You know, it's his lawyer, right? Even if he knew for sure he was guilty, he's going to pretend like he's innocent. So it's not the least bit surprising, his comments. And he seems to be, in my opinion, of course, disingenuous, like he doesn't know how investigations work. Just because they haven't charged him yet doesn't mean he's not guilty. Given how many investigations SLED has had to open since the death of Paul and Maggie, that could be a factor in why this case is still unsolved or nobody has been charged yet. There have been so many different roads they've had to veer off onto. And let's not forget that Alex himself redirected SLED's attention to an actual road. The road, the one that he had attempted to take his life. Bit of a distraction, don't you think? Quote, he loved his wife. He loved his son. The murders were done in the most brutal fashion, unquote. And he noted that he had reviewed Murdaugh's text messages with his wife and that there was no indication of a domestic dispute. That's, more being kind of naive here, because if no text exists, that doesn't mean or equate to that there were no issues at all. I know it's 2021, but not everybody throws down only in text. It would not be documented if they were having marital issues and fighting in person, old school style. He mentions the murders were in brutal fashion, and yeah, awful. I can only imagine what that crime scene looked like. Brutal, for sure. But many husbands, fathers, mothers, wives have committed horrific, horrendous, horrid, brutal killings of their quote-unquote loved ones. And he ended with, quote, he didn't do it. I feel strongly that he didn't do it, unquote. I must point out to remind you, this same lawyer is the one that said, quote, I don't think you choose to have a flat tire or stage a flat tire to commit suicide. That makes no sense. There are many things being reported that are incongruent, unquote. And he said this days before the announcement came out that Alex was turning himself in for the botched insurance fraud scheme. So, yep, guess what? Mr. Griffin, he did stage a flat tire to commit suicide, just not with his own trigger finger. He also disclosed that Alex contacted him the morning of the shooting, September 4th. Mr. Griffin was vacationing with his family at the shore not far from the Murdaugh's own beach house. And he received a request to meet with Alex, and it was in regard to the law firms forcing him to resign. And according to him, that morning before the shooting, Alex did not appear suicidal. And he claims that Alex's frame of mind changed during the course of events later that day. Well, it wasn't that much later. If you met with him in the morning, Alex's shooting took place in early afternoon. That's a hell of a quick change in frame of mind, and even quicker thinking on who to call, who you think would help you to pull off this scheme. I mean, if you decided today to do the same thing, would you have somebody immediately on mind who would comply with your request for them to kill you? Who, like, you have like a Rolodex of people who would do that? Rolodex is way old school. Depending on how old you are, you might not even know what a Rolodex is. This was Mr. Griffin's explanation. Quote, in that conversation with him, and I've had clients at the end of their rope before, I've been doing this for over 30 years. I talked with him, and I was concerned. Wait, so you were concerned at some point during that meeting? Okay. Let's continue. Quote, was this something that would cause him to try to kill himself? And I had that conversation with him, and I felt reasonably confident after I left him that he was not in that frame of mind. And I don't think he was in that frame of mind at that point in time. But then he went and he met with a close friend, and then he had another friend that he was going to meet with who refused to meet with him. And I'm not going to name names. After that, he did not feel like going forward and continuing down that path. And he felt like ending his life, unquote. But wait, there's more, because Mr. Griffin continued, quote, I don't think it was an elaborate money scheme. It was a guy who had lost his will to live. And if he was going to kill himself, he wanted his son to be taken care of. The irony of ironies is that he had a significant life insurance policy. He had a suicide exclusion, but that suicide exclusion was no longer valid because under South Carolina law, they're only effective for 2 years. That policy was taken out more than 2 years ago. Alex was unaware of that. Had he known that, he did not need to involve anyone else. He could have just killed himself without involving another person. He wasn't meant to die that day, unquote. Well, I know it sounds terrible, but what does Alex really have left to live for besides Buster Murdaugh? The rest of his days will be nothing like the first 3/4 of his life. Is anybody buying this claim or this idea that Alex Murdaugh didn't know anything about life insurance policies, or he didn't know South Carolina law as far as suicide clauses are concerned? I sure as hell hope that you're all shaking your head no. He was a lawyer. Of course he knew and would know how to find that out if he didn't. Yeah, it's not believable. It's just not believable. So Mr. Griffin, dismissed the idea of, Alex staging a flat to commit suicide, but that turned out to be exactly what happened. And Mr. Griffin said the morning of the 4th that Alex didn't seem suicidal, but just a few hours later the shooting occurred. So it doesn't have the greatest track record thus far on judgment calls. So him saying, I feel strongly Alex didn't do it, he may be alone, obviously, in that, definitely. No offense, sir. That's just in my opinion. You're definitely alone. Please, no lawsuits. I get it. You're doing your job. I can't really hate on you too much. You're not going to come out and say, yeah, my client is guilty, unless you're forced to have to admit certain things, like admitting that he had a drug addiction later, and then admitting that he had been misappropriating funds, and admitting that he was in part of this insurance scheme. So now, on the other hand, Alex had something to say about the claim that Maggie had visited a divorce attorney before her death. And he released a statement through a spokesperson on September 30th. I don't know how I missed this from my last update, but, quote, "The most recent allegations by People magazine regarding the state of Alex and Maggie's marriage are totally inconsistent with what we had been told by friends and family members. Also, we have reviewed many years of text messages on Alex's phone, and the conversations between Alex and Maggie portray a very loving relationship. It's our hope that the media will continue to focus on covering the investigation of the person or people responsible for the murder of Maggie and Paul, and not reporting salacious stories with no credible sources connected to the Murdaugh family." Back to this text messaging thing. My husband doesn't even have social media, and he's not like a texty type of person. So if you were to go through our text messages, you would think we had like this boring marriage, because most of the texts are like, what time are you going to be home? Can you stop and grab this? What time's your appointment? There's like nothing of significance in there. If we have to have a conversation about something, it's typically not through text. He comes home and then we talk in person to one another. I understand that a lot of people do text a lot, but that's not the case for anybody. I mean everybody, not anybody. It's early, forgive me. This story should be mostly in our imaginations or on a big screen, yet here we are. I think the possibility that Maggie met with a lawyer should be the least of the worries, okay? People divorce every day. Even if she did, doesn't mean he killed her. But it sure seems he's worried that people will think that, enough that he wanted to address it. He couldn't help himself. Now let's talk about Curtis Edward Smith. That's the man who was part of Alex's botched insurance scheme, scam, whatever you want to reference it. And he claims that Alex set him up. And initially in an interview, I had to go dig it up. It was from the New York Post. I had it in another video of mine. And so I went to go find it because he said that he drove over to the stretch of road. He found Alex in his car. He said that Alex got out of his car brandishing a gun and was waving it around as if he might be about to shoot himself. Quote, "I ran over and we wrestled a minute together, me trying to get the gun away from him. Then the gun kind of went off above his head and I got scared to death and I ran to my truck and took off," unquote. Now, I need you to listen carefully. He claimed, and this what I just read to you, that Alex got out of the car brandishing a gun, waving it around, and that he ran over and wrestled with him to get the gun, and it went off, okay? In a news interview statement to News Nation, Curtis now says Alex called him out to the side of the road, handed him a loaded gun, and told him to shoot him in the back of the head. When he refused, he claims Alex tried to do it himself, but that the wound wasn't fatal. So clearly these two stories, to do two different outlets a month almost apart from one another, are not the same, because this new article is from just yesterday, the 13th. And in this one, he's claiming that, he handed him this gun and asked him to shoot him in the back of the head, and that Smith refused, which any sane person would refuse to do. I would be like, are you out of your freaking mind? There's no way. Which is a bit different than claiming that, Alex got out of the car with a gun and was waving it around, and that he ran over and wrestled the gun away from him and it went off. So why the change in the story, Mr. Smith? And Mr. Griffin said that, Mr. Smith might not have known about the insurance scheme beforehand, but he did oblige when Alex asked him to shoot him. I don't know. That's hard to believe. I don't think there are many people that would be like, yeah, sure, give me the gun. Boom, and shoot him in the back of the head. That does on the fly like that. Like, he just calls him out to this road. He's like, hey, Curtis, what's up? Here's a gun. Shoot me in the back of the head. I don't know. That doesn't sound believable at all. Crazier things have happened. But what if this whole attempted suicide really wasn't meant to end in his death or has anything to do with this insurance thing at all? Maybe it was just all a distraction, an attempt to garner sympathy, since the day prior he was forced to resign from his family's law firm, and he wanted the headlines to read as they ended up reading, which was, prominent lawyer shot on the side of the road. And initially people thought, oh my God, somebody wants this family dead. But that only lasted so long, and the headlines changed to, prominent lawyer ousted from own family law firm. So it definitely backfired if that was his plan. The real plan to change the headlines. Now back to Mr. Griffin again. He says he's obtained records from the medical evacuation to the hospital, in which it notes bleeding heavily from the head, and additional records from the hospital itself have yet to be released to him. And he says they clearly document massive head bleeding. There's blood through the bandage. There's blood around the neck brace. There's blood in the stomach. They opened up the head wrap to try to evaluate the extent of the trauma, and they couldn't see because there was so much blood that it was matted in his hair. Now, if you have any experience with head wounds, even the slightest head wound can amount to so much blood. And just a very brief story, when my son was about 3 years old, he was standing on the kitchen table, and I told him to get down, of course, and he went to go step off the table onto the chair, and the chair moved, and he ended up hitting the windowsill, and he got this gash above his eyebrow. And I was standing right there. It happened in mere seconds. I saw it happen. I attempted to catch him before he fell, but I didn't get there in time. And besides the fact that it was so scary, when I grabbed him and I picked him up, which was just seconds after it happened, or right at the moment basically, the amount of blood that was coming from his head, you would have thought he cracked his head open or that I was shot, because I and him were covered in blood from head to toe. Not kidding you. I was soaked. And by the time we got to the ER, I looked like a gunshot victim. It was so bad. And it ended up being that it was just a gash. He didn't even need stitches. It was just had to be glued. So the wound wasn't anything significant to have caused that much blood, but it was because it's the head wound that causes that excessive blood. And even, cartilage type things like ear. Another one of my children, they cut their ear recently, and it took freaking hours, it felt like, to finally get the bleeding to stop because it was on the outer part of his ear. So this whole, there was blood everywhere, there was blood all over the bandage, blood around the neck brace, blood on the stomach. I mean, that's not abnormal, even for just a minor cut on the head. So it doesn't really mean much to me at all, Mr. Griffin. I'm sorry, it doesn't. Quote, those records are protected by HIPAA. But once I speak with Alex and receive permission, the law firm plans on releasing them to the media. There are no pictures in the records that we currently have, but we hasn't received all the records yet, unquote. So this is interesting. He's not currently speaking with Alex on the daily about all the different lawsuits and charges against him. He is in rehab, but as far as I know, rehabs have phone and you can communicate with rehab residents. Asking Alex permission takes, I don't know, a whole 5 seconds. Why was that not done yet? Or are they trying to withhold these records as long as possible? I wonder. Quote, we're frustrated that we haven't gotten these records. We had a HIPAA request signed by Alex when he was in Atlanta going through detox. authorizing the hospital to give the records to my firm. We had sent that in. It was rejected because the signature didn't match. He then sent affidavits saying it's his signatures. We will hopefully get those records any day now, but we will need to get Alex's permission before we can release those because they are protected under law. Interesting, because he said that he had a HIPAA request signed by Alex when he was in Atlanta. Meaning, is he no longer there? Did he change rehabs? Is he in hiding and no longer in rehab? Surely you can shoot a text to ask if you can release the documents, no? Of course you could. Just my opinion, though, Mr. Griffin. Anyways, one final update. The Murdaugh property in Edisto Beach is due thousands in delinquent taxes, but pending lawsuits may prevent it from going to auction. Court tax records show the Murdaughs owe more than $6,000 in taxes in 2020 and more than $7,000 in outstanding taxes for 2021. Collinson County officials say if the back taxes aren't paid by December 10th, the house will go up for auction. Those officials also confirmed that a delinquent tax notice was delivered to the property last week. But other officials with the county told News 2 that the property will not go to a tax sale because of the pending lawsuits. Could Alex not even pay taxes? Hold on a minute here. So he was misappropriating funds from the law firm, okay? We have the issue with Gloria Satterfield's sons and their settlement, okay? The misappropriating of funds was possibly into the millions. So where is this money? Where did it go? What was Alex spending it on? I'd love to know. But so would a lot of other people, because if you remember, 3 days prior to the deaths of Paul and Maggie is when they were trying to get financial records from the Murdaughs after many attempting to get them to voluntarily give it over. Which brings me back to Mr. Griffin saying that Alex had no motive. Sure seems like a motive to me. What are the odds? What are the odds that after they attempted to get the financial records, 3 days later, 2 members of the family are gunned down on their own property by their dog kennels? And we have no real explanation here that explains what Alex was doing with all this money into the millions, that he couldn't even pay his own taxes. This is $6,000 and $7,000. That's nothing in comparison to the amount of money that he allegedly was misappropriating. Money is a huge motive. You don't even need to be possibly going through a divorce. Like he's trying to say, they weren't going through a divorce. Well, you don't even need that. Money alone's motive. Then you can add in a possible divorce, your son being charged criminally, those several lawsuits that you had against you prior to their deaths, and so much more. And continues to add up now. I'm not quite sure that Alex ever really wanted to die or that he lost the will to live like his lawyer is claiming. And here's why. At this point, Alex has really nothing left to live for besides Buster Murdaugh. That's it. Nothing. And as I said earlier, the rest of his days are going to be nothing like they were the first 3/4 of his life. He doesn't really have much to live for. And at this point, you would think that somebody would end up taking their life and not even have to bother hiring somebody to help him do that. They would just be so broken and desperate and just over all of this and want to end it all. I don't know. I'm getting the vibe that this was all a distraction. Hey, Sled, look over here. Don't look over there. Oh, don't look over here either, because it's about to come out that I was misappropriating funds. Don't look over there. Except it all backfired, so Alex wasn't really wise. for somebody who was such a prominent lawyer. Again, just my opinion, and we're going to end on that note. So until next time, I'll see you soon.